So let me start with the fiscal cliff, which I'm sure everybody's heard about. Essentially, right now, if nothing happens, there'll be a $607 billion tax increase / spending cuts that will take effect January 1st. It's really the confluence of a number of things. One is a temporary budget deal on payroll taxes. One is called the sequester, which is a combination of tax increases and spending cuts. And lastly is the expiry of the Bush tax cuts. Now, some of the tax cuts that will expire I actually think are a good thing, particularly the payroll tax. Some of the spending cuts that would be initiated I actually think are a good thing. For example, ending the extension of EI, which has been extended to 99 weeks in the U.S. I think those small components would be good things. I think the totality of the fiscal cliff is a major problem. The U.S. economy can just not handle $607 billion being taken out of that economy, particularly the expiry of the Bush tax cuts, which would raise marginal rates and would raise taxes on capital. I mean, simply put, although I think the Congressional Budget Office overestimates the effect of this fiscal cliff, but clearly this would put the U.S., I think, would put the U.S. either at the brink of or in a recession in 2013, which obviously has ramifications for Canada. Right now where this stands, I'm sure as most of you know, the Republicans in the House have put out an olive branch in the form of accepting more revenues. However, they don't want tax rate increases. This is something most people confuse, right? That you don't have to increase tax rates to get more tax revenue. So the GOP in the House has said they will allow for more revenue by closing deductions and loopholes. That's about $800 billion a year, or sorry, $800 billion over 10 years. That's the figure they've put on the table. The president has now clearly stated he wants tax rates increased, and he wants $1.6 trillion over 10 years. So right now the dividing point seems to be, are we just getting more revenue or are we increasing tax rates? And I think that will be the dividing point over the next month and a half as the GOP in the House and the President negotiate what I expect to be a short-term fix. I really do think what they're going to aim for is something to get us through the next 6 months or a year, and then let's take that time to negotiate a longer budget deal. And the Republicans in the House clearly want that longer deal to include entitlement reform, which would be reform of the two big health care programs, Medicaid and Medicare, and then their equivalent of the Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security, which is Social Security in the United States. Now, longer term, which I think is even as contentious, if not even more contentious than the short-term deal, is the spending profile in the United States for the federal government. So what I've done here is shown you President Obama's plan as of 2011. As many of you might know, he didn't actually offer a plan in the election. So the most recent budget plan that we have from the president is from 2011. That's the blue line at the top. So over the next 10 years, the president proposed to increase spending by 56%. The blue line is the draconian plan put forward by Paul Ryan and the House GOP, which would increase spending by 36%. There's a very small cut in spending in the second year of the plan. It's pretty hard to actually see it. For reference, if you actually grafted on what Prime Minister Chrétien and Finance Minister Martin did, the cut would be substantial. So the Canadian flag with the arrow is a hypothetical what the federal government of the United States would have to do to match what Canada did in the 1995 budget. And as you can see, it's substantially below even the GOP plan, although to be blunt, the Canadian plan would actually get the U.S. in balance within 10 years. If we look at that as a share of GDP, you see a similar story. So the last one was just nominal spending in dollars. This is government spending as a share of the economy. Again, you see the president's plan at 23%, trending upwards towards the end. The GOP plan is at 20%, again trending upwards. Now the reason that they're trending upwards is the demographics of the baby boom. And they just start to hit in about 2020. That puts real pressure on both Social Security and Medicare. And to be blunt, again, neither the GOP plan nor, and particularly the president's plan, fundamentally deal with those programs. The Ryan plan gets you some savings in Medicare, although I don't think it's enough. The president has basically called for a status quo on Medicare and Medicaid. And indeed, in many ways, he's actually calling for an extension of the existing programs, even though most observers readily admit both programs are in serious financial trouble. So the fiscal balance, which is obviously just the difference between revenues and spending, the red plan again is the GOP plan in the House, and the blue plan is President Obama's. So this is a deficit as a share of the economy. You can see that under both plans it improves from about 9% last year. It's now 7% this year. The plan is by 2015, 2016 to get it down under 3%. Now, the problem with both plans is they assume very strong economic growth. They assume continuing low interest rates, and they assume cost containment in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. None of those three are even close to practical or reasonable assumptions. So this data for both the GOP plan and the President's plan is an absolute best case scenario, which, as we noted yesterday with our own government, you should always tread lightly with using optimistic assumptions. The better way to plan a budget is cautious optimism, even pessimism on revenue, and realistic spending assumptions. So neither of these plans, it seems to me, are realistic. So the U.S. is looking at a long-term deficit above 3%. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Long-term, that means increasing debt for the U.S., and they've already, frankly, had an explosion of federal debt over the last 4 years. Indeed, the federal debt in the last 4 years in the U.S. has gone from about $12 trillion to about $16 trillion, which is a publicly held debt by the federal government in the U.S. So we have, on the fiscal side, we have both short-term problems and long-term problems in the United States, both of which are uncertain in terms of what that looks like. Do we get spending cuts? Do we get tax increases? What type of tax increases? What kind of spending cuts? So there's a great deal of uncertainty, and I don't think it's going to be resolved in the next 6 months. I think this is going to take probably the better part of 2013. The second area to talk about, obviously, is Obamacare. Depending on your view of Obamacare, you'll like different pictures that are up there. The frank reality of Obamacare, it's now the law of the land, and I just don't see any way that the GOP can undo this. The Obamacare will come into full force 2014. It will be in place for 2 full years. I just don't see the next president running on undoing Obamacare. I just don't think it's realistic. And in fact, the Speaker of the House himself has said Obamacare is the law of the land. We need to deal with it. Now, there are some problems that will show up in Obamacare regardless of what the House does. I've just tried to summarize some of the key components of Obamacare. The easiest, well, there's 2 things, to note about Obamacare that will show up in 2013. First, the Supreme Court has said that what they wanted to do on Medicaid is not constitutional. What Obamacare wanted to do was really pay off the states to expand Medicaid, take on more of the Obamacare program in exchange for federal funds. The Supreme Court said that violates the Constitution, and they couldn't do a quid pro quo with the states. So what actually happens to that is still unclear, but it will have to be resolved because it is a core part of the Obamacare plan. More importantly, however, I think is the fundamental flaw in Obamacare, which is if you mandate citizens to get health care, and if they don't, they pay a penalty. But then you simultaneously say to insurance companies, you have to accept people regardless of pre-existing conditions. And if you set the penalty fairly low for people not buying insurance, think through the incentive structure. I mean, why on earth would a healthy person ever pay for health insurance? Particularly as community rating means you're not going to get a lower rate because you're healthy, or because you don't smoke, or you don't drink, or you're active. So the incentive for you as a healthy person is don't go into the insurance pool, wait until you get sick, then you go to the insurance company who now doesn't have a choice. They have to accept you into the insurance pool at full coverage at a lower rating than you should have, and you just start to see the math move forward every year, which is more and more people are going to opt to not be covered, and then when they need coverage, force the coverage into the insurance system. The second effect will be for small and medium-sized firms. What it looks like is what is happening, and I think what will continue to happen, is exemption for small firms. If you're a small firm with 9 people and you now are thinking about hiring your 10th person, and as soon as you hire the 10th person, you now have to provide health care coverage, I guarantee you don't hire the 10th person. You start contracting out, you just don't hire staff people. That incentive is going to have an effect on the number of Americans who opt in for federal coverage. I think the budget right now, in terms of how many people they think they're going to cover under the federal mandate, is woefully optimistic. I think it will at least probably be double what they're estimating for the number of people that they're going to have to cover. Now, there is a growing GOP consensus on how to fix health care. The problem is, of the 5 things the Republicans tend to agree on, 4 of them the president has said are clearly off the table. The only one where my sense is that there is some discussion for a compromise is allowing cross-border sales. So what that means is that if you're in California right now, you can't buy insurance outside of the state. But in California, they have laws about what type of insurance you can purchase. So for example, in California, which I was actually quite pleased at, in California, the basic insurance coverage has to cover hair transplants, which I thought was reasonable. I thought that was part of any core insurance plan. It has nothing to do with my own situation. But now, the problem, though, is I don't think anybody would reasonably say that that is core health insurance. Now, if you go to Idaho, you can get a very basic health plan for very little money. It's less, I think it's about $500 or $600. The problem is if you're in California, you can't buy that insurance plan. You can't get that basic coverage. The GOP has repeatedly recommended that that the U.S. loosen those laws to allow what's called out-of-state insurance coverage. There does seem to be some discussion on that. On the other 4, the president has just clearly said, President Obama, pardon me, has clearly said that the other 4 are just not open for discussion. So, put it differently, the amount of room of commonality between the GOP and the president and the Democrats for health reform or tweaking Obamacare is actually very small in my view. Now, an important issue which we're actually going to publish a paper on, I think in early January, is, well, it has to do with tax distribution, but don't let me keep you for 1 minute because I guarantee you it's interesting even though it doesn't sound interesting. What I've shown you here is the relationship for the 5 quintiles, so that's all earners in the United States broken into 5 groups, 20% each. The green bar is the percentage of income that they get or earn. The red bar is the percentage of taxes that they pay federally. Okay, so the easy way to look at this is that 80% of earners in the United States earn more proportionately than they pay in taxes proportionately. Okay, so in other words, they're getting more income than they're being forced to pay taxes proportionately. The only group that pays more proportionately than they earn is the top 20%. They earn 55% of income and they pay 70% of all tax in the United States. Now, under the president's plan to increase tax rates, coupled with the Obamacare taxes, which also increase tax rates, this will get worse. The top 20% will go up to about 72% of total tax. The bottom 50% will pay no income tax. Now, the challenge for the United States is, this is a list of all the OECD countries, so these are all the industrialized countries. The ranking that I've shown you is the degree to which each of those countries rely on the top 10% for their revenues. The U.S. is the highest. The U.S., more so than any country, any industrialized country, relies on the top 10% for income. Put it differently, the U.S. already has the most progressive tax system of all the industrialized countries. The combination of Obamacare and the budget resolution will make this worse. Now, the problem with this, and part of the paper that we're writing, is this fundamentally distorts the democratic decision-making process. Right? And the way to think about this is when you as a voter go to make a decision, in simplistic terms, different parties present you with a choice of, I'm going to tax you at this level, and I'm going to provide you with certain goods. Other parties say, well, we're going to tax you less, and we're going to provide you with less. Other parties say, we're going to tax you more. And we figure out where the optimal intersection is between the tax burden and what we get from government. That decision fundamentally gets distorted when you have 47% of the population who don't pay tax. Because the decision for them is, you're offering to do A, B, and C, and I don't have to pay for A, B, and C. So I don't even care if A, B, and C are A, good ideas, or B, value for money, or C, productive relative to the alternatives, because I don't pay the price of that. Now in Canada, as you can see, we have a less progressive tax system than the United States. In many OECD countries. Part of that is because of the GST and the presence of sales taxes. part of the recognition, though, is that we have been able over the last 20 years to make better fiscal decisions through our governments than the United States. And so the increase in this skewing of the tax burden of the top 20% is going to have real significant consequences for the U.S. to be able to make decisions, particularly very serious decisions about reforming Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and defense spending. Policy uncertainty, again, the real theme, and Alex is going to spend more time. This graph measures policy uncertainty beginning in 1985, and you can see the spike in the Obama administration in 2010, 2011, even 2009. Now, the reason this uncertainty is important is that many economists, certainly my view, is that this uncertainty is linked with slow economic growth. That when we are in an environment where it's difficult for us to make decisions because we can't form expectations. So as an example, in the United States, right now, if you're a business person, you fundamentally don't know what your tax bill will be next year. Think about how you make a decision whether to invest or hire staff if you don't know the tax burden of making those decisions. And so what you can see in this graph is GDP is the bar, and the red bar is average growth. And what you can see is the recession after Reagan and the recession after Bush, you see fairly strong rates of economic growth. That rate of economic growth has declined. And certainly President Obama has had a very slow recovery. In fact, there's some great academic work. This is some other work comparing recoveries after recessions. The red line is the Obama recovery. The black and blue lines are the recoveries from other recessions throughout the 20th century. I'm only throwing this data at you to show that it's fairly clear that the Obama recovery has been ahistorically weak. That normally coming out of a recession this deep, we get very strong economic growth, the so-called V recovery. And that just has not materialized. And I think a big part of that is the uncertainty with which individuals and businesses, what they face in terms of trying to make business decisions or even decisions for their family about investing, saving, or undertaking entrepreneurial activity and starting a business. So I think uncertainty on a go forward is a huge problem. And again, Alex will spend time on that. The fifth one, which I'm shocked that this was not a election issue, and I haven't seen any coverage on this, which is the Supreme Court of the United States. One of the lasting legacies outside of Obamacare, I think, will be the Supreme Court. So the oldest member of the Supreme Court right now is Ruth Ginsburg. Now, she's a liberal, so if she were to retire, there's not really an effect on the court in terms of balance, but there is on the next two. The next two oldest justices are Justice Kennedy and Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia is rightly seen as the leader of the conservative group on the court. He certainly is the major thinker in terms of textualism and that approach to constitutional interpretation. Justice Kennedy is the swing vote. He is normally the court comes down on a lot of issues 4-4, and Justice Kennedy is the swing. Now, if either of those retire, and I think it's quite likely both could retire, you will, for the first time in 30 years, have 5 liberal justices on the Supreme Court. If you go back and think through the number of decisions the court has looked at over the last 3 decades, if they had 5 or even 6 liberal justices as opposed to 4 and 4 with a swing vote, the United States would look very different today. There are a number of laws that have gone to the Supreme Court that I think having 5 or 6 solid liberal justices, you get a very different legal interpretation and thus a constitutional interpretation. And again, it's surprising to me that there hasn't been more discussion of President Obama's effect on the court, because he certainly, I think the odds are, will be able to appoint 2 justices. Justice Souter is also potential for retirement, but again, he's a fairly solid liberal. So again, it's really Scalia and Justice Kennedy that are the keys to a lasting legacy for Obama if he were to switch the court to a long-term liberal majority on the court. Finally, is just the future of Helicopter Ben, or Chairman Ben Bernanke. His appointment is up in 2014. The commentary I've read thus far is that President Obama will reappoint him if he wants to. I think there's 2 things to consider. One is Chairman Bernanke has turned the Fed into its most political in the last 30 years. That's a general consensus, that the Federal Reserve has not been this political or this close with Treasury in 30 years. I think that's important given what's going to come down the road. At some point, inflation will show up, and at some point, the Federal Reserve is going to have to respond. Given how political it is, I think this is a consideration that you have a chairman who sees things not only economically but also politically. And I think that's an important consideration. Secondly, is just the practical ability of the chairman to unwind the monetary stimulus that he's injected into the U.S. economy over the last 4 years. And so I do think this is a fairly serious consideration about monetary policy through the Federal Reserve, as Bernanke is I think, probably more than likely reappointed. So again, the two key takeaways, or really the key takeaway is uncertainty. Just so much uncertainty with respect to tax policy, spending policy. I didn't get a chance to talk about energy or trade, but certainly there's uncertainty in both of those portfolios, as well as monetary policy. And then the historic or potentially historic appointments to the Supreme Court. And then finally, the Obamacare. Again, I think there well may be some tweaking with Obamacare, but to be blunt, it is the law of the land, and both the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have to deal with Obamacare.